It's doing okay for now.
Mm-hmm. I can tell the difference.
I hit the button.
Your mouth and the rest of your face.
And we're live.
Excellent.
It is Tuesday, May 25th, 9:02 p.m. Icelandic time, and 5:02 p.m. DC time, 4:02 p.m. in Chicago.
Wouldn't it be great, Kate, if we could all just use one time to describe what time it was?
That's a terrible idea.
Wouldn't it be convenient in a moment like this?
No, that took just a few seconds, and I was fine with it for clarity's sake. Now I know exactly, except like it doesn't make any sense because like look how daylight it is. It's like meaningless that I'm about to go to bed in like 2 hours. Because it's so bright out, you couldn't even like 9 p.m. means nothing to me. I guess. Anyways, there's all of these things. I feel like it just doesn't make any sense. The universal time thing. So I promised a story. Do you have the videos, Ben? Or are you still getting them?
No, I have them.
Oh.
But you're doing the first one, right?
I'm trying to. I might not be able to.
Dramatic Iceland footage.
Well, the first one, okay. Let's see, hopefully. This is, it'll surprise absolutely no one that, it's like slowly uploading. It's not going to get here in time. So you have to do the first one too.
Okay.
It's a cross. I'm on the other side, by the way, obviously, of the continental divide, Ben. So this is a cross-continental divide operation to play these sheep videos.
All right. So you want me to tee up the first sheep video?
Yeah.
Here we go. Sheep video number 1 being shared.
Okay. So
just tell me when to play it.
Yes. So I'm sitting in my room on a farm in Iceland, and John and I, it's like 10 o'clock at night, and I see the farmer going out with all of these bottles into the barn where I know the sheep are. And I said, "Oh my gosh, where are you going with those bottles?" And she said, "To feed the sheep." And I said, do you want help feeding the sheep? I would love to help feed the sheep. And so I volunteered to feed the sheep. And this was how I spent part of my evening. And if you think this is the end of the story, trust me, it is only the beginning.
All right, wait, I got to find the relevant, whoops, hang on. There it is. We're going to play it.
Oh, nice.
Sheep action.
Can you hear it okay?
I can't hear it, but it's like pretty, you might have forgotten to click the button that says sharing audio, and it's a little glitchy.
Let me restart it with, with noise, because I think it's actually important to have the noise.
Because there's lots of ba and then sucking sounds.
And there's also exclamation of Kate Glee. No, there is no there's no sound available on this, I'm afraid.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll go to the next part of the story. So I am like extremely happy. Moment of absolute joy, and this farmer woman, even better, has brought beer out to the barn, and so we are sitting in the sheep barn watching all of the sheep in their stalls and their little babies and feeding the sheep with bottles, and it's adorable. And then I'm very, very happy, and I'm like, oh, I also see that you have baby foals and like horses everywhere. This is amazing. Like, what do you do with the baby horses? Are you training them for riding? And she's like, no, actually, they're called blood mares. And I was like, huh? And she's like, they're called blood mares. We basically get the mares pregnant, and then we siphon off the blood until we get 6 liters of blood. And then we send it to manufacturing for pharmaceuticals. And it's used in the weirdest of all things to make fertility drugs for pigs, which basically like you have bigger litters of pigs. And so it increases like litters of pigs. So you kill horses to make pigs. And there is this like moment where I'm like, and she's like, and then we just, the foals go to the slaughterhouses after that, they just die. And I'm like,
They eat them.
wow, you're killing all of my woo. I'm in like such a great mood about feeding this baby sheep and being surrounded by sheep. And now you're telling me about killing baby horses. I'm desperately trying to switch the conversation away from talking about killing baby horses. And suddenly the farmer lady goes, oh, look, that sheep is giving birth right now. And sure enough, this is exactly what is happening. This is kind of a longish video, but basically, yes, she is giving birth while also suckling. Like the other one that came out beforehand is like feeding, and she's like trying to give birth. So we were like watching this like crazy thing happen. And about like, I don't know. So we're watching this happen, and we were watching her going to labor. And then like, this is the farmer, and she kind of comes in and she's trying to basically get the sheep so that she can help it because it's hooded. It's come out with the sack like kind of over its head, and there's only one hoof. You could hear her talking. And she's like, oh, I should go help it. And so she's goes over and tries to basically help this. And you will see in a second, the sheep freaks out because this is what sheep do all the time generally, but especially if they're in the midst of giving birth and you're approaching their young. So she runs away. And so she's kind of, and then she like drops her scarf. And this is, by the way, full of poop, this like whole general area. It's not exactly like an operating room. Anyways, at this point, she kind of is like, Kate, or she was like, hey, do you want to like, she was like, well, actually, okay. So then it runs away. She tries again, and it kind of like gets past her, and she's not able to do it. Yeah, she's not able to do it by herself. You can kind of see her struggling. And this baby hanging out the back, and this other baby's like, where's my milk? I'm just here for food. What's happening?
And wagging its tail very fast.
At this point, yes, it was actually, John was like transfixed at like the lambs feeding and the tail wagging. It like goes faster if they're like actively feeding. It's very, very cute. So anyways, then it runs away, and she's like, okay, scarf off, time to get real. You have to help me. And so the video ends because I'm like, okay, no more like fun documentary in lieu of fun.
I just want to say I went to Iceland and this didn't happen to me. This is just like a Kate thing. Like, you know, you go to Iceland and you end up birthing lambs. Like, that does not happen to me. I'm just saying, I have done many things in my life, but when I go on vacation to Iceland, I don't find myself being a midwife to sheep. Okay? You just tell me when you're ready,
true.
KK.
So then all of a sudden, I'm not like filming this anymore. Now I am actively helping deliver a baby sheep and bodily holding all of my body weight, the mother sheep's head against like the wall of the barn so that like she can't get away. And she's like, the farmer is tugging at like the baby and trying to get out the baby. And like the mother sheep is like freaking out, and I'm pinning it against the wall. And finally this happens. Hi, little guy. Sorry it's so lossy, but anyways, it's very he's still for a second, and then all of a sudden he kind of like kicks and sputters and kind of like moves around and like starts to breathe and like kind of move around, and like she's like placenta, and then the rest of us are like kind of like, oh, okay, thank God it's okay. And then the thing stops again, and actually this is the crazy part of the story. The lamb is not okay. The lamb stops moving and is very still on the ground in the cold mud. And we're just like looking at it. And then we both, like, she's like, you know, the farmer grabs grabs the snout and like kind of tries to push all of like the fluid out of the snout. And then like, she's like, can you like, and she tells me to start like pushing on its chest. And so I'm pressing on its chest and like thumping it. And then she's like, the mom is freaking out. So she's like, grabs the mom and is going to take care of the mom. And she's like, you, and she hands me just like she picks up the lamb and she just grabs it by its hind legs. I have to stand up for this part. And she's like, just go like this. Just go like this with the hind legs, just like a pendulum. And I am just like swinging this newly born lamb back and forth like a grandfather clock in like this barn in Iceland. And like, we put it down, it's not doing it. So we like try some more stuff and she's about to suck out of its mouth and I've got my fingers in and I'm scooping out more gunk from its mouth and its throat and it's like gagging and like I can feel it trying to breathe and it's coughing. And then I like pick it up and I swing it again. And then like finally it gives like this, like we're like doing this for like 10 minutes and finally it gives like this cough and like this like it's been like kind of wheezing, grasping. Finally gives this like huge cough and this blah, and we're like, oh, okay, it's all right. And she just like, this woman like looks at me and there's like this newborn calf. I'm covered in blood and amniotic fluid and like cow shit. And she's like, looks at me and I'm like, realize that like, this is not just like this thing that we've gone through together. She is like terrified that there is like, I remember that I am a guest on an Airbnb and she is like, oh my God, if this lamb had died, I would have gotten a 0-star rating. And like no one would have come to, no one would have come to my farm ever again. Oh no, you wanted to play it again with the video, with the sound? Oh no, this isn't the one. The other one is,
oh, that's, sorry.
It's the one that's it's the one with the blue shirt where it kind of lets me goodbye.
Sorry.
Anyways, so we sit there for 25 minutes and this woman is like clearly just like kind of like, what have I just done? I was just having beers and feeding baby lambs. And then what did I just like put this woman through? And I'm trying to like tell her that this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And she doesn't have to worry about it without sounding like too much of a weirdo. And we sit in this barn for like 25 minutes and watch this little guy finally stand up. And then we put him in his pen. And then I go the next morning and I tell John to take a picture. And while he's taking a picture, he gives me a little kiss goodbye. And it is extremely cute. And and everyone should come to Iceland. It's a lot of fun here. Yeah. I smell like sheep. That shouldn't be like shocking to anyone. I don't have access to a washing machine for another 5 days.
I just want to say, you could go to Iceland a dozen times and not have this happen to you because you don't happen to be Kate. All of which is to say that we're not allowed to have fun anymore. We have sheep birthing emergencies on our vacations. But we are allowed to have Ada Palmer return.
But to tell us about Vikings, I'm so excited, Ada.
Because it's Iceland week on In Lieu of Fun.
It's a little bit, like just by coincidence. But also, I want to hear Ada on Vikings, because they've never heard before.
Which is when you think hard of mammals, at some point there needs to be a of this where like you have these cute foxes and foxes are wandering around Iceland having a great time and they're hunting little birds and they're hunting pictures of all of the.
Is she cutting in and out?
Yeah, Ada's cutting in and out. Are you
Ada, you're bummer. You were so clear a second ago. I don't know what's going on.
Is that better?
Much better.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Am I good now? All right.
I think so.
Don't touch the thing. Okay, order of mammals, right? So you have to imagine this children's picture book where there are these foxes and they're wandering back and forth and eating little lizards and hunting birds and birds' nests. And then you get to the midpoint of the book, and then there's suddenly these legs that are sheep legs that are like way taller than the whole picture book because these foxes are this big. But they were the largest thing in Iceland for ages and ages and ages because they'd come across the Arctic ice shelves. And it's not until monks come and bring sheep that anything larger than the cute, tiny, adorable Arctic foxes are actually in Iceland. And then, moral of the story, don't start a new settlement with only celibate male monk settlers. The monastery doesn't last, but the sheep do. And so when the Vikings come, it's this lovely empty island full of sheep that are wandering around and plural. And how did they get there? Who knows? There's just all these wonderful sheep there available already that have already adapted to being able to survive in the cold there, unlike so many other creatures, for example, a cow. And when we think about the thing where they are still raising horses and then using the horses sometimes for meat, it makes a lot more sense when you remember that a cow can't live through the winter outside, and these Icelandic horses can. So that having a cow in Iceland meant spending all summer growing hay and gathering wood to heat the barn to keep that cow alive through the winter. A horse is a horse and could be outside like the sheep and the goats and be okay. And so it's a different investment of energy to get the same, to get different amounts of meat, milk and stuff, but an important one. So briefly to be clear, my qualifications for talking about Vikings are A, falling in love with Viking mythology when I was a tiny kid, thanks to the Duller's Norse Myths children's book, which many people know is one of the best children's books ever in the history of time. In fact, one of the best books ever in the history of time. And I often chat with fellow fantasy and science fiction writers about where we keep our copy next to our desk. You know, up, down, bottom, right, left. And then growing up and becoming a historian and developing the curiosity and, you know, how to approach primary sources versus secondary sources interests in it and reading more on it, but being very aware that I'm not a specialist in the subject. I'm a specialist in the Italian Renaissance. And if you want to know how to walk into a market and buy an apple in the Italian Renaissance, I can answer that. The answer is actually that you can't without a letter of introduction. But for Vikings,
we're going to get to that at the end of the show. That'll be like a special bonus right after we wrap up the show. We're going to hear why you can't walk into a market and buy an apple in the Italian Renaissance. But that's not what we were talking about right now.
Yes. But so with Vikings, what I'm very aware of is that I'm not an expert. And so I'm very interested in approaching it from the point of view of, you know, what primary sources do we have? What secondary sources do we have? And especially what are the sources of the confusions and what are the sources of the confusions and especially the misunderstandings that dog our understanding of it? Because all subjects have that. And so I've looked a lot, not just at primary and secondary sources, but the question of when we have contradictory readings of things, or when we inherit old, messed up and confused versions of stuff where we think A is A and A is actually probably B or F, where that comes from. And that's a really cool history. And goes back really to the 17th century in some sense, but also in Viking culture earlier. So my microhistory of why we have so many errors about Vikings begins with this being a culture that wasn't very excited about writing things down. You know, in Viking society, the epic manly way to show off is reciting enormously long lists of stuff and being able to recite an entire book and having memorized all this information. The oral tradition element of the culture lasted a very, very long time. So even though we think of prehistoric as being very early, technically the definition of prehistoric is before there's a written record. So, you know, prehistoric in Egypt ends several thousand years BC, but prehistoric for Viking ends in 600 AD. And you don't get to ancient until that point because that's the oldest written anything. So when we're trying to reconstruct stuff, we do have information. We have other people writing about Vikings, and we have what we can figure out archaeologically from tombs and so on. But none of the written material is very old. And most of the written material that we have about the mythology in particular is well after Christianization,
right,
in the period of its dominance. And so we have to work out backwards how to get back to what was there before. And it's not just that there's been Christianization cross-pollinating things. So we don't know, the murder of Balder, it's got elements akin with Jesus and resurrection. How much of that is going back and forth? Answer, we don't know. It isn't only that. At the point at which this is being written down, especially by Snorri Sturluson, our very important Viking historian, there's a tendency within European culture to, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, consider things more legitimate if they're connected specifically to Greco-Roman antiquity. That being connected to that makes something valid and important. And so when you pick up Snorri's Edda, which is our source for a lot of the best stories, like the Utgard's Loki story and so on, Thor dressing in drag and the theft of Thor's hammer and all these lovely things, when you start reading it, it begins by telling you not only that in the beginning there was Adam and Eve, and then they had descendants who forgot that God had talked to them originally, but deduced from observing the fact that there are patterns in the movements of the stars, there must be divinities, and then sort of made them up from human heroes. But then he starts telling you that, like, the grandson of Adam, and they have two kids who are Cain and Abel, who are also Loki and Balder, and that then their descendants are Odin, who lives in Asgard, which men call Troy, and his son is Hector, and his son is Thor, and Thor is married to the Sibyl, who we call Sif, who's also the Delphic Oracle. And you're like, no, she's just not. She's just not the Delphic Oracle. Nobody is married to the Delphic Oracle. What are you doing, Snorri? And the answer is that it feels more legitimate, and his understanding of this is that these are garbled versions of the same legends that the Trojan War is a garbled version of, and that he's trying to reconstruct. But because in 1100, 1200, linguistics isn't very advanced, all he's got is, well, this begins with the letter S, and this begins with the letter S, and they're both women, so sure, they're the same. And there is a sophistication to it, but there's also an amateurness to it compared to our senses of linguistics. But it means that the primary sources we have are really confusing and contradict each other all the time. And
what about the Icelandic sagas, though? Because we do have this.
I mean, we do have
this
them, but
incredible. Again, I guess it's not. It's 1,000 years old, but it's quite substantial, and it's a weird mix of history and family legend.
Yeah, and they're very useful. But when we're trying to reconstruct something like metaphysics or the fascinating question, what was an ice giant? To which the answer is lots of different things, ranging from a volcano to Finland are an ice giant. But when you're reading one of these sagas, it'll give you the long genealogy of people, and then they're on their way to a place to negotiate a marriage, and then they stop at an inn, and then a giantess comes into the inn at night and eats one of the random travelers and then leaves again. And then they keep going and go to the other place, and they're like, sorry, I'm late delivering the thing for the king. The giant just came in and ate one of the people in the inn, and they got a terrible Airbnb review, and then we moved on. And the insertions are very confusing, and they're also very contradictory. So, an interesting question, for example, is we know one pivotal story is the death of Balder. And the well-known, best-known versions of this have Loki create an arrow made of mistletoe, which he then tricks Balder's blind brother Hod into firing at him, and then Balder dies.
Okay, hold on. We're already surpassing anything that I know yet. So hold on. I need to know and I've been reading about them kind of, but I want to know, Ben, can you also help here? What is saga? This saga stories that, and what is that versus are those all of, I thought that the saga stories were part of the things that Snorri wrote down, or is that not right? Or did he translate them?
Let me finish this example, and then you'll see why the cross-comparison of the primary sources is so tricky. So Snorri tells us that this is the case. He also tells us that Loki is Lucifer, but he tells us completely different contradictory things about Loki in other parts of the same text. The other source we have for Loki versus Balder, and specifically for the death of Balder, is the Gesta Danorum, which is a history of the kings of Denmark in Latin, not Icelandic, but written by one of the figures in this period. And it's got a whole bunch of sagas of Viking kings going around and lots of weird stuff. But then there's suddenly this bit where it's like, there was this princess, and she was supposed to marry this guy, but Balder was there. And you're like, why? There haven't been any gods in this, okay. And insisted that because he was a god, he had to marry her. And then it becomes this weird love battle. And then they have a war against each other. And then there are 3 weird sisters in a cave with magic soup. And there's a prophecy about a magic, like, surcoat. And then the other guy drinks the magic soup. And then they eventually murder each other. And Balder is killed by a person whose name begins with the letters H-O-D. But otherwise, the story has no connection at all to any of the content in Snorri. And so that's very typical of what we get in sagas. It's not just that it'll be slightly different. It'll be so contradictory that when we try to put this material together, you never have anything that isn't contradicted by other things. And what we're doing is trying to triangulate from many different types of sources back. So these sagas are long epic poems that are generally telling the history of human kings, often focusing on one genealogical set of descent or one family, the history of the ancestors of this particular king or this particular monarchy. And these will be long, and they're composed by a number of different figures. And, 95% of the action in a saga will be humans doing stuff. And it'll be a mixture of documentable historical figures whose actions in the saga are similar to actions that we can document otherwise, and humans that we don't have traces of, or who we do have traces of, but we don't have any evidence for the specific things that they do. And some of the things that they do in a saga will be, they sailed to a place and founded a town, and archaeologists have found this town, and everything checks out. Good. But other things they'll do in a saga is stay in a hotel, and then a giantess comes and eats somebody. Because 5% of the content,
and I just want to say
sagas,
that his archaeologists have not proven that the giantess didn't eat that person. So far true. We are all we have no information that contradicts the sagas on the giantess point.
Yeah. And so 5% of the content in any given saga will bear on mythology and folklore spheres, and will depict a god or a giant or a prophetess, a seeress, or other factors that help us figure out the mythology. But they'll always be very idiosyncratic and often inconsistent with the details in others.
But how different is that, say, from the Bible, where, you can read Judges and there's undoubtedly, a lot of history in there.
I mean, it's very similar to that.
Hezekiah really existed, right? You do some archaeology and you find Hezekiah's wall in the middle of Jerusalem, and then of course God intervenes, and Goliath is probably bigger than whoever, right? But I mean, it's
very similar to that. However, the challenge is, what do you do when you have that and you don't have any historians writing down stuff, and you don't have other written record material to compare this to help make it consistent? And especially when you only have, for the most part, and Snorri is the exception, which I'll get to in a moment, for the most part, what you have texts are focusing on the humans where the theological content is a tiny margin, which makes figuring out what is the metaphysics, which are these deities, what are they doing, extra challenging. And I do use Judaism or Christianity as comparisons for this. But when a student asks me, why is it hard to figure out the Viking stories, I say, well, imagine if you were trying to figure out Christian theology and you've got 2 Penguin paperbacks with selections of incomplete pages out of randomly selected Christian texts written in 6 different countries over 500 years. You're not going to come out with a coherent idea of what Christian mythology or Christian belief is. You are going to come out with the sense that Mary is important and that Jesus is important and that certain events like the crucifixion are important, but you're going to have contradictory versions even of those because they're interpreted differently by a 14th century Catholic versus a 17th century Calvinist versus a contemporary American Southern Baptist. And so that's what we're trying to do with this material. It's not that it's unusual to have contradictory records, but we have very little, and it's spread over a very long period of time, which is why often the answer to a question, such as one of the big questions that people investigate are Frigg and Freya, these two very important goddesses. Are they the same figure? Are they two aspects of the same figure, or are they not? Because they have similar names. They have similar dynamics with their husbands in complicated ways. They have some comparable associations with magic. And when we look at things like not only texts, but place names, which record ideas and practices, etc., we figure out that the answer to are Frigg and Freya the same person is sometimes. Sometimes it's pretty clear that the author of a thing or the maker of a thing believes these to be the same figure. Sometimes it's extremely clear that they are two different figures that aren't at all the same as each other. That it isn't consistent over time. And many of the confusions that we have in the mythology date from earlier efforts, mostly in the 17th and 19th centuries, to try to make it one coherent, crystallized thing without that sense of change, and to try to figure out there must have been an version that is the true version. And so people would take the puzzle pieces and kind of squeeze them to fit with each other when the honest answer is they don't.
So I want to ask about the 19th century in this regard, and particularly Wagner.
Right. Well, and I didn't Kate's by saying what's up with Snorri.
It's okay.
Okay, so actually,
get to that in a second. I want to hear Ben's question.
Let's do Snorri first.
Okay, sorry.
Because he's sequentially first. How much of our... what is the role of Snorri here, and then what is the role of Wagner here in kind of creating unity where there is none?
And there's a teensy link in between in the 17th century, which I'll talk about it momentarily. So Snorri, to give you good dates, he's born in the late 1100s and he dies in 1241. And if you want to compare him to better known aspects of European history, he's a contemporary of Peter Abelard, so not long before Thomas Aquinas, to give you a sense of where we are in the development of what you would get in a history of philosophy or literature class. And he's the best educated person in Iceland for a number of reasons having to do with his father being wounded in a feud that resulted in him being raised by a sort of prince. And he is a scholar and he works for the kings of Norway and he writes a history of the kings of Norway. But he also decides to try to write down some of the mythological stories, partly because he has a sense that they are going away, but especially because he's concerned about losing skaldic poetry, which is a particular way of writing poetry using kennings. A kenning is a formulaic, roundabout way of referring to something. So you can say the treasure of the sky, and you mean the sun. Or you can say the moon of the forehead, and you mean an eye. Or you can say raven wine, and you mean blood. And in skaldic poetry, because ravens eat corpses, and in skaldic poetry, you layer a bunch of these together to make an extremely roundabout.
Seems like a lot of fucking assumptions to be making. It feels like I was actually thinking. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but I know I just was like thinking about this. I was thinking about the construction of language and the construction of definitions today as we were driving, and I was thinking about how how much because we had John McWhorter on earlier, and then we've been like thinking about slurs, and I was thinking about how obviously contextual languages, but then also how it's like literally a series of analogies, and that you're just trying to use other words to analogize what you mean by this word and what this word means. Specifically, like a combination of words. And so anyways, but what you're saying right now strikes me as like this slightly like a particularly artistic or kind of poetic way of doing that. Intentionally
opaque. You have to be learned in the stuff to get the references.
Got it.
So then in an Eddic poem, it'll say something like, 9 steps Fjorgen's child takes with difficulty from the serpent of whom scorn is never spoken. And
they're almost like riddles.
Yes, they are. And you have to know that Fjorgen's child is Thor, and you have to know that the serpent of whom scorn is never spoken is the Midgard serpent. But sometimes they get more opaque than that. And it'll be something like the sunlight of the forearm, which means gold, because you make gold armbands out of it. Or one of my favorite is the mercy of the fish of the valley. And the fish of the valley is snakes. And the mercy of snakes is when it's not cold, because snakes hate cold. So the mercy of the serpent, the mercy of the fish of the valley is summer. And it's
that shit is opaque. No, yes, thank you.
And he's concerned that that's being lost because a lot of the referents are.
And well, it should be. Sorry.
And so he writes this down and he summarizes the stories, but a lot of it is, people want to know why whetstone is referred to as Thor's headache. Here is the story where Thor fights a giant and gets whetstone stuck in his skull. That's why whetstone is known as Thor's headache. So Snorri is much more concerned to give us 172 different ways to say gold than he is to tell us where the world tree came from.
What the fuck?
He doesn't, his priorities are not our priorities. Ben, and so he only in fragments gives us what we want to know, and we have to piece the rest together, because what he wants to teach us is how to write this extremely difficult poetry.
He knew what his audience wanted from him, and his audience wasn't us.
Yeah, very well.
Yes, fair enough.
So Snorri's Edda, which is known as the Prose Edda, explains a bunch of these stories and then has a whole bunch of quotations from earlier, otherwise lost skaldic poetry, which tells us other stuff and which is closer to less Christianized, less trying to pretend everybody is from Troy stuff. And so the elements encapsulated within Snorri are super useful, but they're all fragmentary because he just quotes the few lines enough that are enough to tell us that ravens are called, or the blood is called raven wine. He doesn't give us the rest of it, which he assumes we have.
And what language was he writing in?
So he's writing in early Icelandic or Old Norse. So we would call this language Old Norse. And the other major set of primary sources is the Poetic Edda, which is our second Penguin paperback. Here's one of my copies of this is the Prose Edda. This is the Poetic Edda. There we go. And it's composed of a bunch of anonymous poems that are older than Snorri, and Snorri studied it, and Snorri quotes it a lot. And these poems, unlike Snorri's, don't have helpful explanation except for the bits he quoted. And so these are the ones which say things like 9 steps Fjorgen's child takes with difficulty from the serpent of whom scorn is never spoken, and we have to figure out what this means. But additionally, the poems are written by different people over a span of probably 3 centuries. And some of them are 9th century and some of them are later. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. And also, in the 17th century, when there was a sudden very beginning of what we could call proto-nationalism, there was a surge of interest in older texts. Again, if we can find in antiquity, that makes us cool element. And so led by one of the bishops of Iceland, there was a binge of studying this stuff, which was then, 400 years old or 300 years old in the 17th century. And they decided they wanted to try it. And they wrote more poems in this style and wrote them into the same manuscript. So part of the work we had to do later is figuring out which of these are 17th century fanfic and which of these are medieval stuff. And the 17th century stuff is also cool, but when we're trying to figure out what they actually thought at any given time, it's extra confusing. And then you fast forward to the 19th century. The 19th century is interested in this material because by that point, nationalism for reals is rising. And one of the big projects in the 19th century for every competing culture in Europe and some beyond is to demonstrate that you have an ancient culture. And this is the period in which England is like, Beowulf proves that we have a national epic. Everybody wants to have a national epic. Iceland wants to have a national epic, and particularly the Northern European countries. Jakob Grimm is one of the figures involved in this, really want to argue for the importance of Germanic culture in parallel to Greco-Roman culture and especially Latin culture. So they're very excited to have these myths and have them be better than Greek myth They want them to be ethically better than Greek myth. And they have them, and they know that some of them are medieval and some of them are 17th century fanfic. So as they go through, and you'll be familiar with 19th century ideas of deep archetypes, there are these universal archetypes, and there's the white goddess, and there's the trickster archetype, and there's the sun king archetype. So they have this concept,
and the mother.
The mother goddess. So they go through this, and then they say, okay, well, clearly the ones that don't match our archetypes must be the ones that are fake. And so they go through without realizing what they're doing and systematically curate it to reject the poems that don't match their pre-existing expectations, which are shaped primarily by Mediterranean mythological ideas. And so a number of very important chunks of the primary sources get thrown out for a while in the 19th century through the theory that this doesn't match the archetypes we know are there, therefore must be wrong. So for an example, one thing they really want to be true, they really want Odin to be a more monogamous father figure than Zeus, because that's one of the ways that their mythology can be ethically superior to Mediterranean mythologies, is that their good father figure can be monogamous. But there's one of these poems which I just
he
love,
turned ladies into swans. He's like a total. It's not even just that he's not monogamous. He's just like a jerk about it.
Well,
so,
I mean, there's this Harbard song poem in this, which is one of the ones they reject, which is you open it, and even if you know the stories, like you've read Deleuze, you know this, and then you open it up, and like, what? Because it's got Thor traveling home from Jotunheim, and he comes to a river, and Harbard, which is a well-known pseudonym for Odin, is there with a boat. And Thor's like, take me across the river. And Odin's like, screw you, I won't take you across the river. And Thor's like, who are you? And Odin's like, I'm Harbard, ha ha ha. And Thor's like, well, I'm Thor, son of Odin. And Odin says, guess what? Your mother is dead. And Thor says, what? My mother is dead? That's very upsetting. And Odin says, yeah, also you look like a wuss and you don't have any shoes. And Thor says, take me across and give me some of my breakfast. And Odin says, why are you boasting about your breakfast? Boast about something serious. And Thor says, I just murdered this giant and this giant and this giant, none of whom we've ever heard of from any other story. What were you doing while I did that? And Odin says, I slept with this woman and this woman and this woman. What were you doing? Well, I murdered these people and this person. What were you doing? Oh, well, I tricked this wizard into giving me a staff. And then I murdered him. And then I slept with this woman and this woman. And then it gets like more extreme with clearly what is sexual assault and more.
But can we just like, we have a term for all of this now.
The 19th century is
which is just toxic masculinity.
Right. But the 19th century is like, this poem is fine. This poem is not allowed. This poem is clearly fake.
Although there is
a forgery, so they kick it out.
Although Wagner does retain Odin's infidelity.
Yeah, and some of the infidelity, but in a much more Greek style, which is to say,
yes, he makes him much more Zeus-like.
It
seems like the main thing he does, though, which I've always negatively appreciated about him. Like, it's a noble effort, but it's not true to the source text, is that he creates sort of narrative unity out of it. And it's, as your description goes, it's way more chaotic than that. And so he's sort of trying to do what I think he thinks Homer did, which is create a kind of you use the term urtext, like create a source text out of the whole thing. And
create an epic. And it's easier to do that with the bits about humans, because even in the original sagas of the Nibelung, those are fairly coherent and have people in order doing a thing. It's the actual gods doing stuff parts that are very incoherent. And that we struggle to put together at all, and that clearly contradict each other even within the same text. And you'll have one section of Snorri where he says that Loki is Lucifer and is the devil, and then a little while later Loki is being super helpful and saving everybody, and you're like, clearly there has been an evolution in attitudes toward this figure. What does this mean?
And how much of it do you think is evolutions in attitude over time? And how much of it is that, Iceland's population is small. It is scattered. It is not especially in touch with each other. The time is, to get from Norway to the scattered parts of this empire that doesn't have leadership is, there are different clans, there are different tribes.
Yeah, and it's far beyond Iceland as well. A number of countries are involved in it. And when we look at things like place names, which are immensely useful, we'll notice, for example, that a figure like Uller has lots and lots of places named after him and lots of inscriptions that mention him. However, in the written texts, he does like one sentence worth of anything and then doesn't appear at all. That tells us he's very important in these times and places that didn't leave us a written record, but they did leave us a place name record. The places that did leave us a written record happened to be places where this figure was less important. And that's where, when I mentioned there's, is Freya and Frigg the same figure? There are a number of place names which sound like one or sound like the other, where there will be local legends or things that clearly connect to one or both of them, but sometimes they're very separate and they're in the same story and they do separate things. So again, exactly, it's the diasporas of both space and time, which means that there are many variants on this in the original.
So even variants at any given time, you go 10 miles and the story has different names and means something else. The
story itself recognizes that. And there are, Snorri expressly states that Odin and Freya, who are the two main magic wielders, did a lot of traveling, and that everywhere they went, they had different names. And that all the different groups and tribes of humans that they encountered told different stories about them and gave them different names. And then he lists lots of names of Freya and lists lots of names of Odin. We have, I think, over 100 names of Odin. I can recite about 50 of them, but all from different areas, which Snorri and others are very interested in collecting, and which give us interesting information about the figures and what their associations are, but which also tell us that Snorri himself is also extremely aware of the fact that there's variant, and the expectation of variant is built into the belief system itself.
So David has a great follow-up question on what Ben asked, and I'm also wondering, David, it's so lovely to see you. Thank you for your background. I don't know, hold on, I'm going to make you big. Go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thanks so much, Ada. It is fabulous to hear you. You're blowing my mind again, as usual. So thanks for that. In your opinion, to what degree does the desire of humans to find a pattern, because people are looking for a pattern, how does that affect our understanding of culture and history?
So I think it makes us very much want to fit puzzle pieces together in a way that leads to both successful connections and also errors. And that the most important way to cope with that is to recognize that putting the pieces together into something that fits together is useful. And the different reconstructions of Viking mythology that people can do, and Wagner does one, and I'm doing one for a new novel series, and other historians work on them, are very interesting and are very useful. And you can mostly put the pieces together into coherent narratives. However, what you have to do is always be aware that you are constructing that narrative, and that, in fact, the original pieces probably have a lot more gaps. And so long as we're willing to have these things be side by side and always say, this is a reconstruction, I will show my work with this reconstruction so that you know the places where I've jumped across and the places where I've guessed that A is B as opposed to A might be B, or A is sometimes B and I've decided that it's always B. Because it's only when we make it into coherent structures that we can then inhabit that space emotionally, tell those stories and think about what ethics they communicate and represent. But we always have to be prepared for it's also more fragmentary. And I think another element of it that we've gotten much better over time, and Tolkien is actually one of the moments in which this is, he and his peers were working on this linguistics stuff, or some of those who realize that the 19th century threw out things it shouldn't have thrown out and bring those babies back along with the bathwater, that we can do a lot of really neat and deep cultural access via linguistics itself and which words are related to other words. So I've been working recently on disability and medical terminology in Viking stuff. And there's an often quoted and very interesting passage in the Havamal, which is the section of the Poetic Edda in which Odin gives advice for humans. It's his, here's what to do, humans. And I love comparing it with the advice in other religions, because other religions, it's like, thou shalt not kill and honor my name and do all this stuff. And Odin is like, okay, there's 3 things you got to do. 1, don't go outside at night unless you have to take a piss. 2, if you're hiking across a mountain, pack a lunch. 3, don't have sex with witches in a cave. And you're like,
I love the in a cave qualifier. Yeah, the prohibition is not against sex with witches.
It's
except in a cave.
Yeah, you're like, okay, that was clearly hard-earned and specific advice, Odin. I will remember. But there's a bit in the Havamal where he says, the best thing for humankind is or are fire, the sight of the sun, health if you can keep it, and a reputation without stain, or living without doing bad deeds. But when you zoom in on the word health there, the Viking word for health is derived from the word for brain. And we can sort of focus it in on health of the mind, which is really neat to connect to a lot of the other details in the Viking mythology, because every single one of the male adult Aesir gods is maimed. Odin is missing an eye, Tyr is missing a hand, Thor has a shard of whetstone stuck in his skull so that he has chronic migraines, Loki has his mouth sewn shut so he has scars all across it and a maimed face, Heimdall has gold teeth, meaning his teeth have been knocked out and replaced with gold, and he also, there's a passage that says Heimdall's hearing is hidden under Mimir's well or under Bifrost, so it suggests that he's deaf in one ear. This is very normal for a Viking culture, where it's very uncommon for a warrior to live into later parts of adulthood and not be maimed. So this is a culture in which health doesn't expect absence of disability. Health means health of your mind is functioning. Disability is common and expected. Very different from the idealized perfect gods of Greco-Roman antiquity, but that becomes visible mostly when you look at the deep linguistic level and when you put together those fragmentary patterns. Because notice there's no coherent story for many of these things. We don't have the story for Heimdall's injury. We have the story for Thor. We have the story for Odin. We don't have the story for Heimdall. Tyr, we do have the story. Hod is blind. We don't have a story. There may not have been a story. It may have just been Odin is blind in one eye and sees in the other eye. So when he and Frigg have 2 sons, one of them is blind and the other one is not blind, and it averages out. But, so we take bits out of the stories and bits out of the fragments, and we realize there's a pattern. And that, going back to the original question, is where the pattern matching is really useful. We have to be careful to make sure that our pattern matching doesn't always try to shove things together into a narrative. That we know that creating narratives is fun and cool, but we want to also look for patterns that are not the same thing as narrative, such as neat, this is a different attitude toward bodily ability and what is normal in an adult body than a Greco-Roman idealized body. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So we need to wrap up. But
yes,
before we do,
answers to questions are always too long.
We need to hear the answer to the question of why you would be kicked out and not allowed to buy an apple if you showed up without a reference at a market in Renaissance Italy wanting to buy an apple.
So the key to this is they don't have any small units of currency left. They'd been using Roman pennies, and just like pennies get lost in the sofa, they're running out of Roman pennies, and they aren't minting new ones. The Middle Ages does very little minting of coin, and what it does is minting of gold coin for payments of large amounts of money. The currency system that they're using in somewhere like Renaissance Florence is a credit system. You go to the fruit stall, you have an account at the fruit stall, they keep track of how much fruit you're getting, and then twice a year, you give them 1 gold coin and you pay off your account, and maybe you have some credit left over. And there's a complicated system where sometimes, you have to pay the meat booth and the fruit booth. And so you take it to the meat booth, and then the meat booth also cancels out some of your debt at the fruit booth, and someone else pays the fruit booth and cancels it back and forth. And it's this complicated thing, which is why 90% of the male population has to be literate, because you can't buy an apple without being literate and keeping track of accounts. So if you're a stranger, you don't have an account, you need a letter of recommendation from someone for them to be willing to open an account for you. And they know if you don't pay your bill, that the person who wrote the letter of recommendation for you is vouching that they will pay your bill. So you go to the restaurant every day for dinner. You go to somewhere like the Three Frogs, the restaurant that was briefly run by Leonardo and Botticelli together, who were trying to make a quick buck running a restaurant. And Botticelli painted the menus, and Leonardo made weird contraptions to make the meat turn around in the kitchen. But everyone hated the restaurant because it had tiny portions, and so it went out of business. But you go there regularly, and you run up a tab, and then you pay it off once a year through this complicated system. You can't buy anything without a letter of recommendation because there is no dollar bill.
And so this, I don't understand why this is an efficient system from the merchant point of view. The merchants are presumably paying cash for what they buy, and they're basically lending to the entire community on a semi-annual basis. Why is that something that they would tolerate?
So they're also using this credit system when getting things from each other as well. But a big part of it is, remember how easily the lower denomination currencies are debased. Copper and bronze coins and silver coins are very easily debasable. And this happened a lot in the later Roman Empire when they were actively debasing silver currency, mixing it with stuff. So there's a lack of trust in those middle level coins, in addition to metal being much more usable for other things. So when you see a painting of a merchant in this period, there'll be scales, and there'll be a bunch of coins, and there'll be all sorts of coins, and there'll be ancient Roman coins and local coins and Arabic coins and other things. But the merchant's job is to sit there and fuss around and measure their density by putting them in water to figure out whether they really are silver, and pile a bunch of them together. And you cannot trust the currency itself.
So none of them are backed as such by currency. They're all valuable because of their metal content.
Because of the metal content. Until in the Renaissance, they start developing more reliable currencies, which have innovations such as a circle around the outside so you can tell if it's been snipped. And Florence has...
Is that Dogecoin? Is that what they're talking about?
Only if it's issued in Venice.
Florence does the really clever thing. You know how in many situations a quarter is more valuable than 2 dimes and a nickel, because washing machines take quarters and parking machines take quarters and lots of things take quarters that don't take other stuff. And so a quarter becomes strictly superior. So Florence made a rule that you had to pay your taxes in the Florentine coins. And so suddenly everybody needs those Florentine coins to pay their taxes. And even if you're in London, you're dealing with Florentine merchants. And so if some random person, coming from Spain offers you some gold and some of it is in florins, you're like, ooh, give me the stuff that's florins. Because I know when it's Florentine tax season, every Florentine in London is going to be scrambling to get enough quarters to put in the laundry machine. They're all going to be scrambling to get enough of those florins. Give me those. So it makes the currency extra desirable compared even to other currencies in the same way, which is the very beginning of what you're thinking of. There being a backing to the currency, there being a value beyond the metallurgical value. So you can, if you happen to have a Roman penny, try to buy something with it. But people would much rather have 1/200th of a florin in credit than they would a sketchy Roman penny, which they might take, but they might not. And so there is that unpredictability, as opposed to here is their reliability.
Oh my God. How did you just spin us like the entire history of of currency in 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Good question, Ben. I'm glad we came back to that. That was well worth it. Did you know that was going to happen?
I was not going to leave that one on the table. No, I had no idea what the answer was. Just extremely high confidence that it would be interesting. Because I think, first of all, the answer to that question was going to be inherently interesting. But secondly, if Ada was going to drop that as like a tidbit, I dare you to ask this question, there's a promise inherent in the exercise that it's going to be an interesting answer.
Oh, most certainly. Ada, thank you for coming on. Oh, again, always. You're welcome, always. There has been a request for you and Sarah Bond to both come on together. I feel like we'd have to make it a 2-hour show because you both have so much to say.
Yeah, we could lengthen it a bit, you know.
Yeah, we could totally do that.
Sarah is on a campaign to bring back the Colossus. I think I'm thinking of joining this campaign with her to advocate more colossal sculptures.
Yeah.
So our guest for tomorrow, Natan Sachs, has canceled.
Bummer.
We will reschedule him for sometime next week. He has a scheduling conflict. So I will come up with a guest for tomorrow, which I will do the show on the Amtrak on the way to meet Ada Palmer in person in Chicago on Thursday. Kate, will you be with us tomorrow?
Yeah, I should be.
All right.
I don't see why not. And I can captain this show if you need to, since you're going to be on the Amtrak. Just let me know who you find, and I will put the show together tomorrow.
Excellent. That will be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we do have lambs that we birth ourselves in manure that we can buy with ancient Roman bronze coins. And, you know, if you have enough of them, the shepherd woman who's birthing the lambs might give you a lamb. That was completely incoherent, but I was trying to bring together the disparate elements of the show.
Well, the lamb of which...
That was perfect. I'll see you guys later.
See you.
I love that. Bye, guys. See you guys soon.